what is called colonial societies. Colonial societies. Colony is an outpost. Spaniards normally live in Spain, but when they move to Latin America, it's their colony. The English normally live in England, but when they started to settle in, I don't know, New England and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and places of that sort, started as a colony. So you have, it's often referred to, you have the mother country. It comes from Greek actually. Metropolis means mother city, and then daughter cities. Here on this map you have Spanish and Portuguese empires in the period that we are covering. So after 16th century, 17th century, roughly about that time. Well, and the story, as you know, starts with, Hernán Cortés. He was official in the Spanish Empire in Cuba, actually. There it was adventurous, did sort of a rebellion. His superior, his superior officer, Spanish governor of Havana, Cuba, told him, don't do anything stupid. But he grabs these 400 people and they land on the coast of Mexico. And these 400 people get into this Aztec Empire. Eventually they get to this, Tenochtitlan something, I not even pronounce it. But it's the current day Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. It was the capital of the old Aztec Empire, and wow. We talked a little bit about that before. First, there was this conquest with a relatively small number of Spaniards and Portuguese who actually popped in there. Aztec Empire was a couple of hundred years old, and it was a confederation of various tribes with a lot of internal dynamics between various tribes there. Some were happy with the Aztecs, some were not happy. Aztec were a warrior group, warrior tribe. They had their temples. They were kind of, became infamous. So yeah, infamous for their human sacrifices. Human sacrifices, which they didn't do too often, but once in a while, to teach their enemies a lesson. They would, do these human sacrifices at great pyramid temples that when you go to Mexico City, you can see them all over the place. We have Francisco Pizarro doing a similar thing in Peru with the Inca Empire. So the Aztec Empire over here, and the Inca Empire over here in Peru. A couple of hundred Spaniards, actually in the case of Pizarro, there's about 200 of them land, and they get into into the territory of the Incas. They find allies, they divide, various tribes within the empire, some of them to come on their side, some of them to come on the side of the emperor. Eventually, they killed the emperor. Well, both of them did, it looks spectacular on paper, and Europeans were fascinated. These conquistadores, conquerors, wrote accounts about their achievements. And very often they also exaggerate. That's also part of it. They want to carry favor with the King of Spain, but eventually, give them some sort of a noble title for the great achievement. So they advertised them, 20 of us and 20 million Incas. There is a bit of exaggeration there, because the process was actually not that simple. We think of it as, well, okay, Cortez came in and this was all over within a matter of 2 years. Where actually this is not true. There was considerable resistance that continued for centuries. And I don't know, the best testimony of this is, well, consider what these native peoples actually of Latin America, in particular these Aztec and Inca empires, what they went through. They were decimated by the plague. I mean, plague like measles, smallpox, and things of that sort. That exchange of Colombian exchange that we talked about, that exchange of germs. So, I don't know, let's say 90% of them, were, or 80%, we don't know for sure, really, those are estimates. A lot of them died from this plague, and, well, go to Latin America today, and there is still a lot of them around. And actually, a lot of them were not assimilated, in a sense they did not become Spanish. They're in the Amazon and in the Andes. Here at the western edge of South America, you have the mountain chain called the Andes, which is, we're talking about 5,000–6,000 meters mountains. So that's between, I don't know, 17 and 20-something thousand feet. That's serious, not like the other kinds. Serious stuff. And a lot of these, Inca tribes stayed there for centuries, and there is still, some of them that were untouched. They never got in contact with those crazy Spaniards. So one of the characteristics of this Spanish colonial civilization was, how shall I put it? Well, this map is misleading, because the Spaniards never controlled the whole territory. It would have been better if they had done the same that is done here in the rest of the world. And these are the Portuguese and some Spanish trading posts in India, in Africa, in China. And this is really what happened in Latin America. There were Spanish cities. Like, modern-day Mexico City. Then, port city of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, or in the Gulf of Mexico. Havana in Cuba was always a very important center. Actually, sort of the heart of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. For one particular reason, like the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico in particular, is an awful place for navigation, for sailing. It's shallow. And before you know it, you run into sand and you're stuck. So Havana Harbor is one of the few harbors in the area of the Gulf of Mexico which is useful. It's a deep water harbor, and it's protected. It's inland, so you can kind of guard the entrance, which is very important for the Spaniards. It was very important. Think of it as a process. Spaniards and the Portuguese were first to start this colonial adventure. As they were already in a fairly advanced phase, the French and the English wanted to join. Now, you're late. So the Spaniards got the best parts, and the French and the English got the leftovers. Well, they were not happy about it, so what they did, both of them engage in, was piracy. hijacked Spanish ships that are traveling across the Atlantic. It was way more than that. It was what is this now? It was way more than that. It was state-organized piracy. Famously, Queen Elizabeth was a great queen. But on the side, she also had some money invested in piracy. She was actually confronted several times by the Spanish ambassador who said, "You finance pirates." And she said, "Can't believe this is happening." And she was. The Spanish ambassador was absolutely right, but there were these Spanish galleons crossing over, and then Spanish organized things like convoy transportations. That means group the ships together. Have one great convoy in spring and one in late fall. So gather a couple of hundreds of ships from all over the Caribbean into the port of Havana, where they are in this deep water port, protected, and waiting for the right time to do the crossings. And then they would, go across the Atlantic and get the stuff into Spain. And the English were not the only one. There is here in the north of France, I believe it's in Bretagne, in this area, beautiful city called Saint-Malo, which a beautiful city to visit, a great tourist attraction today. Wonderful townhouses, prosperous port city. Piracy. These people who built this city were pirates. They made their living by stealing from the Spanish galleons. Therefore, we get to what? Johnny Depp and the Pirates of the Caribbean? Well, yes, that's the same story. That's the same continuation of the same story. Once the English come in. But for now, the Spaniards have the best parts. And they were, as we mentioned, they were looking for gold and silver. They found some. Okay, in the beginning they plundered the treasures of these Aztec and Inca empires. But that was impressive, but there was a limited amount of gold. Then they found silver in these silver mines of Potosi. And then they also wanted land. But land is a tricky thing. What do you do with land? Somebody gives like 200 acres of land, so what do you do with it?
You either put livestock on it, or you grow it, or you either have some kind of natural resource that comes off.
Something, but you're going to have somebody to work on the land. So yeah, land is a valuable asset, and now we buy and sell it. But imagine yourself in the situation of the 16th century, and you go there and and claim I conquer this, and this 2,000 acres plantation is now mine. So what are you going to do with it? You need some people to work on it. So okay, so we have these native people who survived measles, smallpox. So let's make them work on the land. Well, we call this in general the plantation system, or encomienda is the Spanish term that is mentioned there in the book. But I'll be happy with the plantation system because it's important to get the point of it. And at first, the Spaniards argue that, well, you see, these people are not really human beings. First of all, they're not Christian. They do this weird stuff with human sacrifices, and actually Spaniards sort of exaggerate that to make them, look less human, because it was in their interest. If you present them, that they are, really a little bit better than monkeys, then you can actually enslave them. Which is, which I mentioned that before, which led to an early and later, but an early debate by this Bartolomé de las Casas. Basically, you have this Spanish actually the decision came from the Spanish king that no, these people have souls, which it translates meaning, these people are human beings, therefore you cannot enslave them. And especially of course if they convert to Catholicism, which a lot of them did actually, and there was an obvious interest in conversion to Catholicism. You were protected more than if you continued with human sacrifices. So it's bringing me to the very, very interesting dynamics in this between the Spaniards and the native peoples, which actually then repeats itself also in the case of the English. The native peoples always had more problems with the local white settlers, the Spanish and the English, than with the king overseas. So you have interesting cases all over Latin America that native peoples would actually write petitions to the king of Spain and say, protect us from these crazy Spaniards in our midst, who have these lands and they want to make us work on the land. Now what happens if you cannot find slaves for the land? What do? Sharecroppers. Heard of you guys are from the South, you know what sharecropping is, you've heard of it. Sharecropping, heard of it? It means, somebody has the land, you don't have the land. They give you a piece of land, you work on it, but you give, I don't know, half of the yield back to the owner of the land. And there are various kinds of arrangements that you can actually, what the Spaniards, what these owners of these plantations, Spanish plantations, were trying to do to kind of get those native people tied to the land. So there are all sorts of mechanisms that you can do this. You start with sharecropping, but then you end up with loans and getting them to fall into debt. And once they're indebted, then they have to pay their mortgages for years and years and indenture servants, and then there is all sort of abuse and trickery going on there. But these native peoples actually always preferred to deal with the King of Spain than with their local Spaniards. And you have the same thing happening in what is now United States, in British colonies, that the native peoples always prefer to deal with the King of England and not with the white plantation owners, which we kind of today call the Founding Fathers. Not kind of, we really call them the Founding Fathers. So you see during these wars that that preceded the American Revolution, for example, that the Native Americans always sided with what we call here the Redcoats, the British, the troops of the King of England, or in case of Latin America, with the King of Spain. Because they were protected. He offered them more protection than the local Spaniards. So there is a distinction that these Spaniards who settled in the New World were called Criollos, or we call them Creoles. Creoles. So Creoles are originally, the word means Spaniards who came from Spain, but then settled in the New World, in the Americas, and then lived on for 5 generations. 5, 6, maybe several generations. Now the people that we call first generation, or right off the boat, although there are no more boats, right? Bring people in boats. We fly now. But we use the word right off the boat. People who are first generation, in Spanish areas, just came over, the first generation. And then if they stayed, have children, grandchildren, then they're called criollos, or Creoles. So to sum up, the Spanish colonial society actually is organized in three groups. Criollos, Native American, plus those slaves that they brought from Africa to work on the sugar plantations. Now, they were not everywhere. In particular, as you can see on the map, it was in particular in Brazil and in the Caribbean. Sugar islands of the Caribbean. The northern coast of Brazil and sugar islands of the Caribbean, where most of these African slaves were ended up. But in some areas like Mexico or Peru, there wasn't. I won't say none of them, but very few. But these are the three main groups. And in terms of space, in terms of geography, actually, they were kind of separated. Spanish lived in their cities. When I say Spanish, I mean Creoles. That's why we say the Creole city of New Orleans. Now, New Orleans is a little bit an unusual case because it was really a Spanish city, but inhabited originally by the French. So, the term got extended from Spanish to French and so on and so forth. It had its development. But, so the Creoles live in the city, in the cities. Outside, in the countryside, outside of the ramparts of the city, were the native people. And actually, they didn't really interact too much. And then out in the country, you had plantation houses, where you might have, sharecropper natives, workers work on the plantation, or maybe some slaves, depending on where you were. The laws that regulated, well, they were kind of ambitiously put together. They were called laws of the Indies. Were supposed to regulate life in Americas. Laws of the Indies, and first series of them were issued like in the middle of the 16th century, and then they reissued and added and amended and so on and so forth. But they sort of regulated every aspect of life. At least they wanted to. So for example, in terms of cities, they regulate various details like every new city in the New World, in the Indies, is supposed to have a central plaza. And if that city is the capital city of a province, that plaza is supposed to be 50 by 50 yards. If it's a capital city of a region, it's supposed to be 100 by 100 yards. And then cities supposed to have an orthogonal planned streets, what we call grid pattern of streets. So I want to show you some pictures. Okay, a little bit of okay, randomly. square, a grid, orthogonal grid of streets going in all directions from the main square, the cathedral, and usually what was common was to have the governor's residence there by the cathedral. So, I have some more. This one is actually really nice. A smaller one, this is in Cuba, in Havana, in Old Town, the cathedral, the main square, the governor's residence. And then on the sides of the square, you would have the apartments, dwellings. This one is in Peru, in Cusco, the old Inca capital. Main square, cathedral, governor's residence, and then the houses of the wealthiest Creoles in the city. The further away you would go from the main plaza. Now these plazas are often called Plaza de Armas, which means, because they were used for military parades. You would have military parades on these plazas, or where else? Right? You can't do it, in these narrow streets. The further away you were from the main plaza, it cost less, so it tells you that these people who live there were not as powerful, as influential as those people who are living on the apartments facing the plaza. And there were all sorts of, and then when you get to the city walls, you cross through the city gate, and you get into the countryside, and there'll be native people. Now native people will also come in and, for markets to sell their goods and stuff of that sort. So there was a lot of mixing, and actually Spanish culture in Latin America has this gradation of various groups. I told you that there are three main groups. Creoles, it's like, Spanish people, white, and then native, and then African. But boy meets girl, they married, all sort of things happen. So you have combinations like they're listed somewhere. Let me see where. Have all the stuff here. No? Okay. Okay. So beginning with the three main groups, you have Mestizo, which are the Creoles and the Native Americans. Actually, it gets really complicated because there are all these sorts of mixtures. 3/4 this and 5/4 that, and then mulattoes came from the Creoles and the Africans. And then you have this category of, between the Africans and the natives. So a fairly complex society was created. And it's actually very interesting that in spite of everything, a good chunk of native culture is preserved in the Spanish Americas. Those people are still around, and disadvantaged somewhat. It was always the Creoles who were at the top of the scale, but they continued. And they have their own revivals and stuff. South Cuba. So the plaza is also small. But, you know, same things, housing and church and, I don't know, places to socialize. It's a bigger one in Peru, and I want to show you, let me just go through this quickly. Mexico, Puebla. Regulated streets, that's the grid iron pattern that I was talking about. Now, this mentions something. What's the point of these detailed regulations? Is that just some sort of, you know, oddity? Well, it's mostly hygiene. We're talking about cities that, pre-industrial cities, anywhere, not just these Spanish cities, but anywhere, didn't have sewage. Sewage system actually began to be built in the 19th century. So where did the sewage go?
Right up the street.
Right. Or, you know, septic tanks somewhere, who knows where. So these things, you know, need to be carefully regulated. Also, you know, it was very ventilation. People considered it very important. What I mean by ventilation, you don't want to build things just, you know, cram them all together. And definitely you don't want to do things like we do. Shut the windows, lock them up so you can't open them. They considered that stuff to be very dangerous, and they were right. Look at what we do and the amount of allergies that we have. Just went to the allergy clinic. It was full. Why? Because I have an allergy too, allergy reaction. And, you know, custom, for example, to kind of give you an idea of, you know, everyday life of these people, especially the Creoles who were living in the cities. A custom was, you had to do this stuff. You have to open the windows in the morning and get some draft through the house. And it makes a lot of sense. You know, dust and other stuff that accumulates inside. It's food for bacteria. That's what bacteria eat. And they naturally grow. And as they grow, your immune system recognizes them and has a reaction, wants to get them out. So he starts to sneeze, and then we call that allergies. So, it's very important to have well-ventilated houses. A lot of straight streets that can be cleaned easily. Big windows so you can have draft, not these little ones that, you know, we build now. And stuff of that sort. And then these streets and plazas also serve a very important social function. It was customary that usually one evening during the week there would be a corso. That is, you know, let's say Friday evening. People from the city would put on their best dress and go for a walk. And they would actually, you know, go around the plaza. Circulate very often, 7 times. Pardon me, I'm making this 7 times, but the custom was, you know, to go around. So what was the purpose of that? You get to meet other people living in the city and say hi, see what kind of, you know, dress do they have, what kind of clothes do they wear. Did they get something new, or, you know, or they are trying to save some money and, you know, estimate, you know, what's their business situation. Have a look at, you know, children that are around. Maybe I have a son, you have a daughter, maybe we can come to some arrangement. that's, all sort of things of that sort that you can do on the main plaza. The Spanish way of life. And here we have, of course, restaurants. This is the big one. This is, of course, the more important the city, the bigger the plaza. And since this is Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, the most important Spanish colony in the Americas, therefore the plaza itself is humongous. It's called Zocalo today, and it has all the stuff that I kind of described before. The cathedral, I don't know, is this the presidential palace today, which used to be the palace of the Spanish Viceroy. It's the place where the palace was. Let's not get into details. So, the Spanish possessions, and what else do we have? Of course, things that you're familiar with. More what we call Jackson Square, another Plaza de Armas, and wonderful apartments, which are kind of expensive hotels now in New Orleans, and the cathedral, and Cabildo, where the governor of the city used to live. And then let me tell you a couple more things about the organization of this Spanish Empire. It was divided into viceroyalties. Viceroyalties. So, the viceroyalty of Nueva España, or New Spain, Mexico. Mexico. So the viceroyalty, you have the capital city, like Mexico City, and there would be the viceroy. Now, what's a viceroy?
It's like a...
it's like a vice president. It's actually a deputy of the Spanish king over there. Now, that deputy, of course, had a lot of power. The viceroys had a lot of power, but within the system. The system that actually I tried to describe to you in the case of like Louis XIV, when we were talking about these councils of the king, and viceroys usually had a council, which were called audiencias. Audiencias, which are councils and law courts. So you would have, I don't know, 12 or 24 judges sitting on this council. Their job was to control the viceroy. In other words, to check all the decisions that the viceroy makes are in accordance with the law. And then the same system existed actually at a lower level. So we have the high level of, well, the viceroyalty of Nueva España, then the viceroyalty here of Peru, with its capital Lima. Lima and Mexico City are, I believe, Mexico City is definitely, I think it's the largest city in the world in terms of population. But Lima is also, city of 5, 6, I don't remember exactly. Then eventually you have this thing here, where it's now Venezuela and Colombia, which became the viceroyalty of New Granada. New Granada. And this is actually fairly common. Granada, we talked about before, region sitting in the south of Spain. So when these Spaniards cross the Atlantic, they're going to call this, New Spain. And then actually in Mexico, when you cross the city of Monterrey, which is the capital of the province that is called Nueva Castilla, or the New Castile, which is, heart of Spain. One of the regions within Spain. And that's going to happen often, and not just in the Spanish-speaking world, but also in the English and the French-speaking world. Right? England, New England. Scotland, New Scotland. Where's New Scotland? You guys know where New England is, right? New England, Boston, Massachusetts. Huh? New England. And where is New Scotland? Yes, Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia in Canada. And then you have the city of York, the city of New York, and the city of Orléans, to the south of Paris, and the city of Nouvelle-Orléans, New Orleans. And likewise, for the Spanish ones. What else do we have? Yes, finally, to the south, Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, which is a big river in South America, where the beautiful city of Buenos Aires is located. Should I repeat something? Okay, Buenos Aires, in Argentina. Don't correct me, Argentina. And then as you get away from these cities, there'll be more native people, there'll be more mestizos and mulattoes and so on and so forth. English and the French colonies are not that different when you think about it. Although I can say briefly that for the English there was, well, I won't say no completely, but much less mixture with the native peoples. That was a big no-no. So whereas, Spaniards really intermarried with the local population, and then you have this population mestizo, this was rarely happening with the English settlers. It was looked down. Not that it never happened. Things happen. The French, we say empire, the English empire, the Spanish empire. But let's look at what we call like the Spanish empire in the Americas. And go down to Little Rock. This weekend, it's a homework. Well, you don't have to do it this weekend, but go down at the Historical Museum, and they have like the original fort. Do they? I think so. So a reconstruction of the original French fort that was there on the river. It doesn't look like an empire at all. It looks, a couple of wooden houses and strong fortifications, wooden also, which means that there were a lot of people on the outside, but they didn't want to let in. But a fairly small group. The French actually developed this system of trading posts, little fortifications. Literally, I mean little. They're really, kind of small. Up and down the Mississippi River, from New Orleans and in the branches of the Mississippi River, like we, get here Little Rock. Well, this is the Red River, actually. But anyways, so up and down the Mississippi River, St. Louis, and then you jump from the Missouri River to Chicago River and get into the Great Lakes, started as a very small French settlement. And then you follow the Great Lakes into the great French cities. Those were the big ones. Montreal, the capital of Quebec. And then further down the St. Lawrence River, Quebec City. Now, was this an empire? Not really. But it was a system of trading posts, and their purpose was fur trade. That's what the French specialized in. And actually developed quite good relationship with the native population of the Americas, because they wanted to buy fur from them. And they wanted to learn all the secrets of, trapping and hunting. So far, so good. Did I forget anything? The Turks. Move from the Turks. Hacienda. Those were these plantations. Okay, let's say we finished. Do I have any other pictures? This is one of Puerto Rico. Now, let's so we have this stuff. At least start this stuff. So, Islamic Empires. And the Turks in particular. But here actually we have three empires that you kind of need to remember. The Ottomans in the west. The Safavids in Persia. Right? And the Mughal in India. Now, why do we group them together? What do they have in common?
Are they all Islamic? Or Muslim?
Yes, they are. That's one thing that they have in common. Also, these names actually come from particular ruling families that were all of Turkish origin. Now, Turks in general come from this area here, from the Black Sea that stretches all the way into China, then called the steppe. But did we mention the steppe before? S-T-E-P-P-E. Homeland of the Turks. Actually, to be exact, we call them Turco-Mongolian peoples. Turco-Mongolian. Now, who is the most famous Mongol that you know? Genghis Khan. Everybody knows about Genghis Khan. Well, Turks and Mongols are related in terms of language. Their language is fairly similar. And more importantly, their way of life was, in the beginning, very similar. These were the people who lived in these prairies of Asia. They were nomads. They moved around on their horses, and they lived in tents. Camped, for a while, and then they take their horses to another place. And since Asia is huge, these prairies of Asia are stretched for about Genghis Khan in the 13th century, these people became united. That's why actually Genghis Khan is so famous. That he united all these Turco-Mongolian tribes and just attacked everybody around. And since they were good at riding horses and shooting arrows, they were ferocious warriors. And they conquered China, they conquered Persia. I mean, descendants of Genghis Khan conquered Persia, eventually came into India, came into the Mediterranean. So the thing is now that these Turks came into the Mediterranean while this area was already Muslim. So what I want to point out is that the Turks were originally not Muslim. They follow, what do they say in Borat? We are the Kazakhs, we worship the hawk. That's what Borat says. Kazakhs are also Turkish people, right? So they were not Muslim, worshiping. Oh, actually, what Borat meant to say was that the original sort of traditional religion of Turkish people is called shamanism. That's what the word that Borat was looking for. Shamanism. But you'll remember it better if I say we worship the hawk. So it's not Islam. And they actually came into this area of the Indian Ocean, which was already dominated by Islam since the 8th and 9th century, by the Arabs, who were original Muslims, so to speak, if I may say so. They first became Muslims as an ethnic group. And then in the 9th century they built, this great city of Baghdad, and sail up and down the Indian Ocean, so that the Arabs actually made an Indian Ocean into their little lake. And you have the spread of Islam from, Mecca and Medina and Baghdad and Cairo, great Islamic cities, following the coast of Arabia and Persia and India into Indonesia, which you don't have here. But Indonesia today is the largest Muslim country, in terms of population, the largest Muslim country in the world. And it presents a unified economic system, the system of trade relations in the Indian Ocean, that I kind of briefly mentioned before. When I was talking about Vasco da Gama and circumnavigating Africa, and I told you, I remember kind of slipping it in, hoping that you might remember one day, that when Vasco da Gama traveled all the way to Calicut in Goa, this is also a Portuguese colony, trading post in India, that he encountered Islamic, Arabic, and Turkish ships here in the Indian Ocean. They didn't like them being there. Well, now is the time to talk about these people. In particular, we're going to focus on these Turks, Ottoman Turks. Now, their name comes from their founder, the Turk number one, if I may say so, Mr. Osman. Mr. Osman, often called the Osman Bey general. Osman was one of the tribal leaders of these Turco-Mongolian peoples that came in the wake of Genghis Khan and eventually settled on the shores of the Mediterranean, here in the city called Bursa. You have it here on the map. Bursa. Where is it? Bursa. came there as followers of shamanism, and entered into a world of Greeks and Arabs who are living already in this area, right? Greeks here, and then you go to the south of, what is today Turkey, here called Anatolia. Anatolia means the eastern land, the land when the sun rises, and it's a Greek name, because when you're in Greece, this is where the sun rises. So it'll be the land of the rising sun, right? Anatolia. Land of the rising sun. So you had the Greeks and the Arabs already in this area. The Turks now, Greeks being Christian, and Arabs being predominantly Muslim in this period. And you suddenly have these fellows, warriors, family, tribe of Osman. Now why do we call them Ottomans? I have no idea, I think just an error, mispronunciation. But Ottomans are Osman's people. So anyways, one day in the 14th century, they settled there around in the 1300s. So that's sort of, roughly after Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan died in, pardon me, early 1300s, just to give you an idea. And one night Osman had a horrifying dream. When you think about it. He went to sleep, and in his dream he saw a tree growing out of his belly. And it was growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually grow so big that the branches of that tree overshadowed huge amount of land. And he woke up and was scared. What does that mean? A tree growing is a scary dream. What do you think? Makes you know what's growing in my belly. Anyways. So you seek some, but what happens when you dream something and you don't know what it means? We kind of today joke about this stuff, but a lot of people take their dreams seriously. And they're very real. When you woke up after a bad dream, it affects you quite a lot. So anyways, he sought an interpretation, and he found a particular Islamic Muslim holy man. They were called the Sufis. Let's not get into details, but if you want details, Google what Sufi means and you'll find out what exactly that is. And the Sufi, this Islamic holy man, told Osman, well, my dear Osman, this is what your dream means. You will have children, and those children will grow so powerful they will conquer the whole world. But of course there is a catch. You will have to convert to Islam. So Osman converted to Islam, and this is the beginning of the Ottoman Empire and the Osmanli dynasty,